Welcome to Trojan Talks. I'm Byung-Soo Kim, president of the University of Southern California, and this podcast is a space for open conversation with thought leaders both inside and beyond our university as we explore the ideas shaping USC's future. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by Assal Habibi, USC Associate Research Professor of Psychology and the director of USC's Center for Music, Brain, and Society. Her work focuses on how music, something deeply woven into society and our human experiences, helps shape the brain from early development through aging. Assal, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
So I understand that your interest in how the brain is affected and develops with music has a personal origin. And I was wondering if you could start by sharing some of that origin story with us.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thank you for having me. I grew up playing piano, classically trained from age 5. And I always felt that provided me a space, not only for having emotion regulation, space to myself. I was a pretty introverted child, and I really valued that space, but also it provided me a community, people that I could get along with, make friends with, and just carried that throughout my life. My first dream and hope in life was to become a concert pianist, and I really worked towards that. I moved from Iran to France, and I spent a few years working on that. And at some point, I decided that maybe the passion was becoming more of something that I have to do, and I wanted to keep the love for music separate from a career. So at that point, I kind of pivoted into wanting to do science, but the music was kind of always in the back of my head. When I went back to college, I sat through a class called Brain and Language, and it sort of opened my mind into, for me, music was another language. And whatever this professor was talking about, how language is mapped in the brain, I started to think, like, how is music mapped in the brain? I really want to answer those questions. And just knowing what music did for me as a child, and still as an adult, is like really it's my space of quiet. It's my space of connecting with myself. And again, a community of friends. I wanted to understand, what does music learning do for other children? And if we can provide enough evidence of how important and relevant it is in child development, we can hopefully provide policymakers with what they need to have every child have access to music.
When you first pivoted and moved into neuroscience and psychology, was your intent at that time to try to understand the connection between the brain and music, or were you able to bring music into your research interests only later in your academic development?
Later, because at the time, music neuroscience was not a thing. People were talking about auditory neuroscience, auditory physiology, and music was kind of like this thing on the side. I did my bachelor's degree in cognitive science. And then when I did my PhD, I joined a lab at UC Irvine, which was a classic auditory physiology lab. And we were studying different types of sound. And at some point, I was able to convince my advisor that music is a type of a sound. Can we study what does this do? And I've been lucky enough that I've always had advisors and supervisors that I worked with that were open-minded. And we were looking at patients with auditory neuropathy. And I was like, can we see how they process music? What does rhythm mean to them? And from there, I was able to kind of integrate it slowly into my research. And I'd say slowly, maybe from 10 to 15 years ago, music neuroscience is now a field. It's more of like a linear path. You can actually do a PhD with a lab that does this kind of a work.
That's interesting that you said you first started thinking about patients as individuals that you could study. At a certain point, you also started seeing opportunities to do research with respect to children.
Yeah.
And there's a study that I believe you did a number of years ago looking at children in the Los Angeles area.
Yeah.
Who were exposed to classical music. And I was wondering if you could just share a little bit about how that study came to life.
Yeah. So as part of my dissertation of my PhD, after patient work, I looked at adult musicians who have had 10 years of music training or more compared to non-musicians, and saw differences in their brain anatomy and how their brain function and how their auditory system functions. So that really motivated me to think of, where is this coming from? Are you just born with a different auditory system? Maybe you have better memory, working memory, auditory working memory, and that's why you pivot towards wanting to do music? Or is it just the music training and probably really the interaction of both? So when I joined the Brain and Creativity Institute at USC, I started working and partnering with a professor at the Trojan School of Music, Dr. Beatrice Ilari, and we were looking to work with children and follow them systematically over time to precisely answer that question: what was the role of music training? And we again were lucky. We sent an email to the LA Phil, and the education director got back to us, and they were interested, and really, to their credit, very open minded for us to walk into their program and investigate the impact of this program, which is called YOLA, Youth Orchestra of Los Angeles. And the idea was, YOLA really came to Los Angeles when Gustavo Dudamel joined the LA Phil as a way of providing music education to children who do not have access to music. So these are children who don't have private lessons, or their public schools did not have music for them. We met all of these kids. They were 6-year-olds, 40 of them with 40 violins in one room. I can imagine it was pure chaos. And then we followed them systematically year after year for 7 years. They would come to USC and Brain and Creativity Institute, and we study how their training impacted their social and cognitive development and their brain development using neuroimaging techniques and questionnaires, but also interviews with their parents to understand, what does music do to their life.
Amazing. And was Maestro Dudamel, who, as you know, is going to be our commencement speaker in a few weeks, was he a part of the study in any way? Was he helpful?
He was very helpful. I would say a good cheerleader and a motivator to, he grew up with this program, El Sistema, which was kind of really the background of wanting to do YOLA in Los Angeles. And I think for him, he knew how successful it could be, how you can change a child's life with just giving them an instrument. And not to say that these children are going to all become Maestro Dudamel or a musician, but they're going to become adults who have music in their life as a toolbox that they can always go back to regulate their emotion, to find a way to kind of deal with stress in their life, or to make connections and community. So I remember at the beginning when we would go to YOLA at OLA, he would arrive and do really small conducting of the orchestra, of the youth orchestra, and giving every child so much hope. That was the first time in my life I've heard these 6-year-olds saying, I want to be Gustavo when I grow up, which was really nice to hear, that they could see themselves in this, and they valued music in their life. And again, and another perspective is that I also started seeing their parents and families going to the Disney Hall, just really kind of integrating this community of these students into this classical music world that sometimes maybe they felt excluded from. So I think that really made a huge difference. And I've heard him talking about this study. I don't think we need science to prove music is good, but we wanted to show really systematically how it changes the brain in a way that we think is also important for other things: cognition, decision-making, inhibition.
You were saying earlier for yourself that music wasn't just something that you loved doing and hearing, but that there was a community aspect to it. And you were just describing how YOLA is bringing children not just to classical music, but into a community that they might not otherwise have been able to experience. So for purposes of your study, you needed to figure out a way to control for all of those other benefits, really, for music. I understand that one of the control groups was sports.
Yeah.
And so can you just talk about how you tried to control and filter out some of these other factors to focus on how music itself was impacting brain development?
Yeah, absolutely. So we needed control group one, because we were going to study these children over time, and every child gets better with their memory and cognition and language from age 5 to 7 to 10. So we had what we call the passive control group of children who were not doing anything specifically, as not involved in any systematic enrichment program. And then we had an active control group, which were soccer players, sports. And that was precisely really to control for this aspect of social interaction. Are the effects that we're seeing is a result of being part of something that is motivating and engaging and being with your peers? Or is it the music plus that has the effects? And it was really nice to work with both of these communities because we really tried to match every aspect of it. So children are coming from the same background, the frequency of the programs are the same, kind of the way they have a tendency to wanting to belong to these communities were the same as well.
And so what were the results?
Yeah, it was so 7 years of data. I'm going to give some highlights. For us, what we saw is that children in the music group not only got better with musical abilities that we expected them to do so, such as pitch and rhythm and entrainment, but we saw effects far more than just playing music. Effects on their language development, their speech perception. For example, one of the things we call is prosody perception, being able to detect emotion in speech. Musicians are very good at that because you have to kind of especially when you play with others, you have to understand where the emotional state of that other person is. But for that to translate to speech is very important because when you're having a communication with someone, if you can detect even from subtle cues that person is in a sad or angry or happy affective state, you'll have a much more effective communication with them. And that was one of the things we saw in relation to language development for these children. Beyond that, we also saw changes in what we call executive function. So a series of abilities and skills that are known to be very important for life success, decision-making, academic achievement. And one of the core skills was what we call inhibition or inhibitory control. Think about it as delayed gratification. Have a marshmallow now or wait 10 minutes. You can have 2 marshmallows. We do this all the time in everyday life. You decide to grab a cookie for lunch versus waiting for having a healthy meal. And we saw this inhibition skill really enhancing in children who had music training. And not only from a behavioral perspective, but when we put them in the MRI scanner and look at their brain activation, we actually saw more engagement of these frontal circuits of the brain that are responsible for inhibitory processing that were engaged in the children who had music training program compared to both sports control program and the passive control.
And what do you attribute that to with respect to music? Is it the necessity of having to practice and focus for a long period of time? Is it something about the music itself somehow? Do you have any ideas about that?
Yeah. We spend a lot of time thinking about that. I think part of it is when you learn music, you learn a discipline. You learn how to put note after note and then measure after measure and then constantly go back and then correct your errors. And you learn how to pay attention to your errors. But also when you play in an ensemble, you learn when to lead, when you have to step back, when you take turn, and practicing that in a joyful activity, something that is fun to do. Teaching inhibition and delayed gratification is not going to be as effective if you're just telling a child, don't do this, do that. But if they're learning it in a way that is actually rewarding for them, that at the end, the orchestra sounds well. They all did their part for this community to sound well. I think those are really the ingredients that help with this inhibition and delayed gratification.
So comparing the music group to the sports group, though, in sports, you also have to practice a lot. You're also having to work as part of a team if you're playing a team sport. I suppose one difference is at the end of the game, you either win or lose,
Exactly.
whereas hopefully at the musical performance or concert, you're not winning or losing. But what do you see in terms of the differences in the outcomes between those two groups?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, as you just described, I think the two difference in terms of social interaction was one is like all working towards the same goal versus in sports was the winner and losers, the teams. But in general, in terms of our results, things that were really relied on the auditory pathway, such as speech perception, language development, auditory working memory, clear differences between music and both groups. as we kind of move towards what we call in neuroscience far transfer effects on the brain areas that are not necessarily part of what you are practicing. You don't sign up for a music class to have better discipline or delayed gratification. The differences were less pronounced between music and sports, and really more pronounced between music and children who did not do anything, which to me, that's really the sad story of these children who were not provided any enrichment program and having really missed the opportunity to develop these skills in a way that, from a societal perspective, is very low investment to provide these programs, but really gives them a huge advantage in decision making later in life.
And we have seen a very significant pullback over the last decade or longer in public music education programs, right?
Yeah. And unfortunately, even programs that exist now, for example, in California, we have Prop 28, which is supposed to provide music training for every child in public school, arts and music training. But we don't have enough music teachers because over the past decade or so, we haven't done the pipeline of really training music teachers in a way that then could provide training.
One question I had was your study focused on, or was the music group, was it classical music that they were exposed to because of YOLA? And what are your thoughts on whether the results would also extend to other types of music?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yes, they were classically trained because the program came from LC based and YOLA. That being said, they did integrate music because not really by design, but because the community, so YOLA, the way they function is that children who could go to the program, because the program was offered to them free of charge, was within like a 1 mile radius from the center. And a lot of immigrant communities that were part of the program. So they did make an effort to bring music of these countries to their curriculum. And I think that was really effective in a way that the grandparent started to recognize the music. So when they went home, they could play the violin and the grandparent could sing. And that really kind of like completed this circle of participation in a way that, again, these children were given performance spaces and stages to practice and perform, but in a way really elevated their stature in that you are a musician. You don't have to be up here to be called a musician. But I think overall, I don't think the results of what we've studied for us is limited to classical music, but I think music that brings anybody joy and they can connect emotionally with it and they can connect to others with it is probably as effective.
But many parents are familiar with these Mozart for, I forget what the product is called, but the idea is if you listen to Mozart, you'll increase your baby's IQ by X number of points. And clearly your study did not validate that in particular. But
I don't think necessarily it's Mozart. I think it's music in general. And also, I mean, we do see changes in cognition. I think particularly is music making. There is something about the coordination of the auditory, motor, and executive networks of the brain that I think has that kind of transfer effect to cognition and memory and attention and what maybe in that realm was called IQ. Music listening is also good in terms of enriching your auditory environment, but really kind of coordinating these systems, I think it makes a huge difference.
I was curious, we've been talking about music education for children, but you and I have previously talked about the way that it also can be used for therapeutic purposes. In the story that I've shared with you, I had a aunt who had Alzheimer's, and she really wasn't responsive towards the end of her life. But at one point, I actually had the experience of playing the cello for her, and she completely woke up and was dancing and moving her body in a way that was really beautiful, but also very surprising. And I was just wondering if you've started also going back to the work that you originally did when you were in graduate school, thinking about the therapeutic potential of music. And for certain kinds of patients.
Yeah, yeah, that's a beautiful story, and a story that we keep hearing as in the past 3 years or so, we have expanded our work to the other side of the spectrum of aging older adults, and looking at what music can do in terms of therapeutic intervention. We are kind of two branches of work. One is looking at teaching older adults how to sing as a way of kind of combating this question of social isolation and loneliness. This is a big problem among older adults, especially after COVID. So, what we started to do with the support of the National Endowment for the Arts is creating these 20 weeks community choirs for older adults. They come to USC, they have not sang before, they sign up for this study, and they learn how to sing. And nobody wants to sing at the beginning. Everybody's shy, but at the end they have a performance, they invite their friends and family, they're really proud of it. And we systematically monitor changes in their auditory system, in their brain, but also their well-being, anxiety, depression, a sense of loneliness, sense of belonging to community. And we've done this now 3 times at 3 cohorts. It's supposed to be a 5 cohort study. Over and over, I hear from these older adults who have had no connection with music before that I found my voice. I feel comfortable talking. I can sing with my family. I have a community that I feel belong to. So that's been really nice and promising in terms of just working with healthy older adults that are suffering from loneliness and isolation. But going one step further, what about older adults, like the example of your aunt you shared, that are not at the place of learning how to sing or play music, but just listening to music can do something for them? And we recently did a study looking at personalizing music for individuals to listen to inside the MRI scanner. So think about a nostalgic song. That song is
Mm.
very meaningful to you, but that's your individual nostalgic song that may be different from me and others. So we bring older adults in, we ask them about their past, the music they like, and then we find songs that are nostalgic to them. And then we have them listen to those songs compared to the songs that are familiar but not nostalgic, something they heard, but it's not meaningful to them, and unfamiliar songs. When they listen to nostalgic songs in the MRI scanner, we see activation of the hippocampus, which is the memory area of the brain, the reward system of the brain, the self processing areas of the brain, much stronger than listening to something that is not meaningful. And we are now using that as a base of designing an intervention for older adults who have mild cognitive impairment, so really early stages of dementia, and to see whether we can use these nostalgic music as a way of them retrieving memories that may be not accessible. And that's not to say that I think listening to music or nostalgic music is necessarily the cure for Alzheimer's, but I think these individuals really battle a long period of time without having access to themselves and to having connection with their family. So if there are ways that we can introduce 10 minutes in their day that they can kind of retrieve those connections and find a sense of self and find those memories, we have a way of enhancing the quality of life throughout this disease progression.
That's so interesting. I can't remember what I played for my aunt, but now that I'm thinking about this, I think that I actually asked my father
Yeah.
what songs she might be familiar with.
Yeah.
And I think I actually played a song that
It was
she
meaningful.
was meaningful to her. So that's really interesting. One thing you said, I wanted to just go back to it, that you're teaching us, these individuals towards the end of their lives, to sing.
Yeah.
That's a little bit surprising in the sense that I thought most people, sing throughout their entire lives. Although you do hear a lot of people say, "Oh, I don't sing.
Yeah.
I'm a terrible singer. I
Yeah.
don't sing."
Yeah.
Is singing something that that everyone should be encouraged to do more?
I think so. I think we all have a voice. We all sing happy birthday when somebody walks in a room and have a birthday, or when we are a 5-year-old, we sing. And then there's the social inhibition of whether you're good at this and whether your voice is good. I'm not saying everybody is Renee Fleming. No, there are skills and talents and that are exceptional in musicians. But I do think singing is part of our human evolution. We we sang around fires and told stories, and that was a way of communication. And I think continuing that in a way that brings joy in people's life is very important. Again, we don't call it, it's a community choir. Everybody's voice is welcome. And we are not worried about the quality of so much of their singing abilities, but in a way that they can coordinate with others. They can synchronize. We even see like heart rate synchrony among them when they sing together, and then find a space to feel belong to.
Just out of curiosity, because you mentioned that singing and music have an evolutionary
Yeah.
origin, perhaps. Have you had a chance to study singing and musical response in animals?
No, that's I'd love to. I mean, there are a couple of animal models that sing, and there are studies of colleagues I know at Northeastern and at Harvard. There are individuals who are looking at just music processing in animals. I mean, there's that famous parrot. I don't know if you've seen this video, Snowball, who moves to rhythm
Oh,
in 17 different moves in beat perception. So it is part of an auditory system that has evolved to be us. But no, I personally haven't had a chance.
well, maybe later in
Yes,
your.
would love that.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the Center for Brain, Music, and
Yeah.
Society. And at USC, we have so many different people who are music professionals, music educators, neuroscientists. I was wondering if you could share a little bit how that ecosystem of faculty talent and interdisciplinary talent has been helpful to you in your research.
Yeah. Um, as I was doing my work at the Brain and Creativity Institute, I often bump into colleagues on campus or students who shared a similar interest, or telling me, "Oh, I'm a musician, but that's kind of like my side thing. I'm also a professor of engineering, or I'm a professor of medicine, but I like to play music." And I kind of my same story of like my music made a huge role in my life, and how can we collaborate. So 3 years ago, through an initiative that we had at the Dornside College of seed funding for faculty initiative, I put a proposal to just bring the faculty and students together who have that interest, and provide a space for us to communicate. There are really expertise in each field that can come together and really enhance a study or even a research proposal. So this has been really nice and successful. We have now about 32 faculty member and a number of students who are part of the center. We regularly host speakers. We have an annual symposium, which actually is coming up on June 11th, in collaboration with Renee Fleming, who's going to come to campus, and the LA Opera Connects as part of the Arts and Health Week in the LA Opera. So all the faculty will come, they present their work, but faculty have also been collaborating. We had research proposals that have gone out of Dornsive, Viterbi, and Keck on projects that we can work together. But it's really a coalition of scholars who will have interest in music and find ways that each of us can bring expertise to that world.
Yeah, and even you could think about partnering also with the health system, where I believe during the pandemic and perhaps before then, we had Thornton students and others going and performing for patients in the hospital.
Yeah. We actually have a research proposal right now that we are working with the Keck School of Medicine on using personalized music for pain perception and pain relief in individuals who are going through biopsy procedures for cancer. Like, can you find a way of using music to give some relief to that person in relation to their pain perception during that painful operation?
And I understand you're teaching a class this semester with a professor from Thornton,
Yeah.
the music school, and was wondering if you could share a little bit about that class.
Yeah, that's kind of my highlight of semester, because especially this week we have this exciting creative project. The class is called Music, Mind, and Brain. It's psychology of music. Me and Professor Beatrice Ilari collaborated to put this curriculum together as a kind of a way of doing interdisciplinary work. It started small. We had maybe the first year a summer course with 10 students, and now we have 150 students. It's a general education class. And we have students from all around campus. Again, they have something interesting in music. They played music, or they know music may make a difference for them when they're stressed out, and they want to learn about what is the physiology of music and mood regulation. What is the evolution of music? We cover kind of humans, but also the animals. We talk about music in terms of therapeutics. How do you design music interventions? And it's such a rewarding experience because you really get to see different perspective, what each of these students bring. So during these creative projects, what they've been doing is to come up with a creative idea of that put the neuroscience and music together. And we just had a presentation last week of a student producing a movie of neurons of the brain that dance to certain types of music. It's just fascinating how well done and complex these are, and how much they can integrate basic neuroscience like brain anatomy into a musical performance that they composed.
Sounds amazing.
Yeah.
I'd love to stop by and see some of the projects.
Yeah, I would love for you to come by.
All right. Well, Professor Habibi, thank you so much for your scholarship and for joining me today.
Of course, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.